Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. For anyone who's new here, my name's Josh. I'm a photographer and a filmmaker from West Michigan, primarily working in the wedding space. I primarily shoot photo and video together, but today we're specifically talking about video and we're talking about gear because what I want to talk about is how I set up my Canon R3 to shoot video for weddings and events, documentaries. Before I lose anybody who doesn't shoot with the R3, a lot of the settings that I'm going to show you on the R3 kind of are cross platform to the R5 and the R6 as well. And so don't feel like just because you shoot with an R6 or R6 Mark II or R5 that these settings don't work. Obviously a couple of like the custom button settings and stuff will not apply to your camera because maybe your camera doesn't have that button. But a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about applies across all the Canon platforms. But I shoot with the R3 and I've had a bunch of different people asking me how I set up the R3. So let's talk about how I set up the R3 for video. So to kind of kick things off, I want to talk about the first like little shooting menu in the R3, and that's the little red camera, just menu number 1, and just some of the basic movie settings that I do for all of my cameras. This isn't really R3 specific, but just some basic stuff. So recording size and all that, frame rate and all that, that just depends on whatever you're shooting. If you're shooting in slow motion, if you want to shoot 4K or 1080p or whatever you're shooting. But the one thing I will say, if your camera offers it and the R3 does, is to make sure that your codec is set to the all-I codec and not to the IPB codec. The best way to kind of explain codecs is just how much data is actually captured when you're filming. The all-I codec just captures more data, captures more information, and so it allows you a little bit more leeway to do more editing on the post end of that footage. And so if you're shooting IPB, it's a little bit more locked in. You can't do as much editing to them. And so I find shooting on all-I is super helpful if your camera allows it, and this camera does. So I always make sure to have everything locked to all-I. Also, this camera does shoot 6K RAW video. I don't shoot RAW on this camera much. I typically just leave it on MP4. But one of the things I do want to talk about is the movie cropping and the sound recording. Those are both on that first menu here. Let's talk about sound recording first. This is a setting I actually tweak a lot. So a lot of times I'll be shooting some slow motion stuff, or I'll be shooting some content where I know I'm not going to be using the audio from the footage that I'm shooting. And so I like to turn the sound recording off so that I don't have any audio recorded on that clip, and I don't have to worry about that in post when I'm dragging the clip into Premiere. So it just helps to turn that off. Obviously, if you're going to be intentionally recording audio, you want to make sure to have that on, but that's a setting I tweak a lot. And then the final thing on that first little menu is movie cropping. I actually use this a bit too. The sensor on this camera is a 6K sensor, but turning movie cropping on allows you to kind of turn the sensor into like an APS-C, not a full frame sensor. And so just kind of crop in a little bit. I don't know the exact ratio that it crops into, but it kind of gives you a little bit more of a telephoto or Super 35 look to the footage. So if you're trying to get a little bit more reach out of your lens, or if you're trying to kind of crop in on things a little bit more. So just kind of scrolling through some basic other settings here in the menu. The high frequency anti-flicker shooting. I want to talk about that for just a second here because I use this all the time, specifically at receptions during like the dancing and stuff when there's a lot of LED lights and LED lights tend to flicker. This is a great mode for automatically detecting what frequency the lights are flickering at, and then it matches the shutter speed of the camera to that exact frequency. It'll actually detect the flicker rate and then match the shutter speed to that flicker so your footage is clean and doesn't flash at all. So this is super helpful for events and receptions and stuff. Obviously, you're going to be overclocking or underclocking your shutter depending on exactly which shutter speed it kind of tells it that it has to be to match the flicker, but it is a really, really helpful tool to have in the arsenal and really helps make reception footage look a lot cleaner. And then continuing through the menu, I want to talk about picture profiles for just a second here. This camera does shoot in C-Log3. I have and do shoot in C-Log3 sometimes. When I'm not shooting in Log3, I am shooting in a neutral picture profile that I've kind of customized. So if you jump into the picture styles here, they have like auto, standard, portrait, all those things. If you go down to neutral and then click the little info button, you can actually tweak the parameters of the neutral picture profile. And so what I've done, I've dropped the contrast down by 3, saturation down by 1, and that gives me a pretty nice flat picture profile without actually having it be log. And so it's a little bit easier to edit than log footage is, and just kind of helps for some running gun stuff. It still gives me a little bit more dynamic range and a little bit more versatility in post. So that's the picture profile I typically will shoot on. Honestly, sometimes I'll just go to auto or to standard and then tweak that just a little bit, kind of drop the contrast a little bit. That's typically what I do with those picture profiles, is just drop the contrast a little bit. That tends to kind of do the trick. Or having the option to shoot in C-Log3 is super helpful, but it just takes a little bit more work in post. The last couple things to talk about here are on menu 5 here is the high ISO speed noise reduction. I have that turned off just because I want to do noise reduction in post, not on the camera. I don't trust the camera to do the noise reduction how I want it to, so I'm going to do that in post. So I leave that off. And then over on menu number 7, I have the image stabilizer turned on. So that's the in-body image stabilizer built into the camera. But then I have the digital image stabilizer turned off. And we will talk about sometimes when I do turn this on later. For all intents and purposes, I have the IBIS in the camera turned on, but the digital, where they crop in and kind of it digitally tweaks things, that's turned off. All right, so that's the back end, all the kind of nitty gritty stuff that goes into actually programming the camera to shoot video. Now let's talk about the fun stuff, customizing the buttons. So typically when you're customizing buttons on a Canon camera, you go over to this little custom functions menu, which is the little orange camera with the little like bracketing dots kind of underneath it. And you go over to like menu 4 and it says customize buttons underneath that. So you can customize all your buttons there. But there's one button I changed before I do this, and that's the shutter button, because I want to actually program the shutter button to start filming when I click it. So when I'm in video mode, I want it to start recording video when I click the shutter button. So where you go to actually program this is you go into the shooting menu again and over to menu number 7. So this is the red little camera menu, the first menu, and then over to menu number 7, and you go down to shutter button function for movies. And you can click this down to fully press. So I go down to fully press and I have this set to start and stop movie record. And I've just found when I'm shooting photo and video together, I'm flipping back and forth between photo and video pretty quickly. And I'm just used to pressing that shutter button to capture a photo. And it just feels obvious to me to click the shutter button to start recording video as well. And so I like to program that button first off so that I start and stop recording video. That doesn't change the function of the little video record button on the back. That still starts and stops recording. So that's a nice little fallback. But for me, it's nice to have that shutter button programmed to start and stop the video record. Now we jump into the custom functions menu, and let me talk about the buttons that I customize here. So you see on the left-hand side of that menu, there's a little camera icon. Those are all the buttons I've programmed for the photo end of things. And then under the video camera on that second column are all the buttons you can customize when you're in video mode. So the first thing I do on all of my cameras is I set up the multifunction button, which is this little button up here right next to the shutter button. I customize that button to the AF point selection button. So basically I can click that, and at the bottom of the screen, all of the different autofocus zones and modes pop up at the bottom, and I can scroll between them. To make this even more versatile, you need to actually dive into the autofocus menu once you've programmed this and go over to autofocus menu number 4. And on that second little option is AF area selection control. You can click on that and you can choose the main dial, which is the main rotary dial here by your index finger. You can choose that to be what determines the AF area selection. And so now you can click the multifunction button and then rotate your dial and it switches all the different zones. The next button that I customize on the R3 is actually the second multifunction button, but that button is up in the front here, kind of where my little ring finger would hit on the front grip of the camera. And I customize this button to switch between the viewfinder and the screen. And so the R3 obviously is a mirrorless camera, and so there's an electronic viewfinder in the eyepiece, as well as an LCD screen on the back. And because there's two electronic elements, there's a little sensor here in the eyepiece that kind of basically tells the camera when the eye is up close to the camera to switch to the viewfinder that's in the eyepiece, and when the camera is away from your eye or like out in front of your body to switch to the LCD screen. The problem becomes, and this is something I've run into quite a lot, is when you're shooting in bad weather or you're just sweaty, and so there's like moisture on the camera, moisture on the eyepiece, it can kind of fog up and get caught in the eyepiece and tell the camera always have the viewfinder going, even if the camera's away from your body and you're trying to film something. And this can be really, really annoying if you're out on a hot day and you like have to have your eyepiece up because only the viewfinder is firing. And so I've programmed that button to automatically switch between the viewfinder and the LCD. And so if for some reason the camera is not telling itself to switch to that LCD, I can just press a button and automatically have the LCD turn on. Moving on the buttons here, there's a little illumination button that just basically turns the lighted buttons on the back on. I just leave that programmed to what it is. The mode button up here on the top, I leave that one programmed how it typically is on the mode. But the next button that I actually change is the AF on button on the back of the camera here. And I have this button set to start and stop tracking. And so again, this is specifically for video. This is not how I have this set up for photo. But when I'm shooting video, it's very helpful to be able to tell the camera, hey, I want you to stop tracking the subject that you're tracking and then restart tracking something else. And so to be able to just press a button right here on my thumb and have the camera stop tracking and then press it again and have it restart and recalibrate and restart tracking something else is really helpful, especially in wedding spaces when the camera every once in a while will start tracking the wrong subject, or I was tracking someone and I want to now start tracking somebody else. And so this is a really helpful way to just kind of tell the camera, hey, stop what you're doing and now restart and kind of calibrate and catch focus on something else. And then on the R3, there's a little like infrared thing where you can kind of move the autofocus point around. I found this is really annoying just because your thumb is in that spot all the time. The infrared sensor kind of picks your thumb up and just bounces the AF point all over the screen. For now, I have that disabled. And then kind of continuing on to the buttons that I customized, this little asterisk button, which is also up here by my thumb, I have that set to turn peaking on. So peaking is basically the little red lines that a camera can show when you're manual focusing to kind of show you the things in the frame that are in focus. So if you do a lot of manual focus or you're using manual focus lenses, you'll totally know what peaking is and how helpful that can be. So I have that button set to turn peaking on and off. So if I'm in manual focus and I just want to see what's happening, don't want to see the peaking options, I can press that button, turn peaking off. But then if I want to have that peaking guide show up, I can press the button, all the red lines show up on the screen, and I can kind of use that to dial in the shot. The issue though with this camera, and this is an issue that I don't know why this is a thing on a camera of this caliber, but unfortunately on the R3, you can't program to have peaking enabled and zebras enabled at the same time. So for me, I've chosen to have this button be my peaking button because I use manual focus more than I use the zebra mode to kind of dial in exposure. But if you want to have that button programmed to turn on and off your zebras instead of the peaking, here's how you do it. You go into your autofocus menu, you go over to menu number 5 into the MF peaking settings, you turn that off, and then you can go over to your shooting menu and turn your zebra settings on, and then you can go into that button and you could customize that asterisk button to turn your zebras on and off instead of your peaking on and off. But unfortunately, you can't have both of those. So for me, I've chosen to have that button be a peaking on and off setting instead of my zebras. So the last little button at the top of the camera here is the little AF zone kind of button that you typically use to open up your autofocus zones. Because I have my multifunction button at the front over by the shutter programmed to do that function, I have this button programmed to do something called dial function settings. So if you go into the custom buttons and you scroll down to dial function and then click info to set which dial function, you'll see 6 different options pop up of things you can choose to assign to this button. Any of these that you have, you can choose up to 5 of those, and basically when you click the button, those different options will pop up. You can scroll between them and then use your other little kind of toggle at the top of the camera to cycle between those modes. Personally, I don't need any of those. I have those programmed elsewhere, but what I do have this programmed to is to the movie digital image stabilization. So every once in a while, if I'm on a trip and I just know I want to have a really smooth, steady shot without having to do warp stabilizer in Premiere and kind of do all these tweaks to it, it might be helpful for me to turn on the additional digital stabilization the camera offers. And so I have this button programmed so that when I press it, you can see at the bottom of the camera, the little stabilizer comes off, and then with my little toggle up here on my index finger, I can scroll between the 3 different levels of digital, or really 2 different levels and off of digital image stabilization that the camera offers. And so this is just a really handy way to very quickly turn on and off that digital image stabilization where you kind of crop in and the camera digitally tries to compensate for any movement in the frame. But remember, this does not affect the actual IBIS in the camera. This is just additional digital compensation in addition to what's already happening in the body of the camera. I always have the IBIS in the camera turned on, but this button allows me to turn some extra stabilization on if for some reason I need that. So the next button on this list is the depth of field preview button. That's another one of those little vertical buttons that are down here by my middle and my index fingers when I'm holding the camera grip. I have this button programmed to be a mode button, which is the same button that I have up here on top of the camera. I'll talk about why I do that later, but basically it's so I can automatically cycle between the different custom video modes that I have programmed. Then I just leave the little lens function button set to the typical turn on and off the autofocus. I've mentioned this in previous videos. I like the set button on the back of the camera to be set to center my autofocus point. And I know you can do that with the little thumbstick by pressing that in. For some reason, I like to have my set button set to automatically center that autofocus point. And then the last thing I do is I turn on the toggle to direct autofocus point selection with the little thumbstick on the camera. So this is just super helpful for when you're on like a spot focus or something, to be able to move the autofocus point around with this thumbstick. It's just a lot easier than trying to click, one over or tap in the screen. Just to be able to literally move that around with the thumbstick is super helpful. So I turn that on. And so that's basically all the custom buttons that I have set up for the camera. I also have built a custom menu. So I have like my movie recording size, my high frame rate, sound recording, some of my Canon log settings, all built into the custom menu. So I don't actually have to cycle through these menus to access all the things that I typically use. So I do that. That's not really a custom button setting, but it does help a lot. So now that we've finished kind of programming all the buttons and all those settings, now I want to talk about one of the things that makes this camera incredibly versatile, which is the 3 different custom shooting modes that it has, basically where you can program 3 different modes in the camera so that you can just press a button and recall any of those settings that you have with just a click of a button. So if you want to switch, say, between 120 FPS and 24 FPS, you can just switch between custom mode 1 and custom mode 3 or whatever you have those set up, and it'll switch all your settings, switch your frame rate, switch your shutter speed, all those kind of things. It's super, super helpful. But you have to make sure that all those buttons are programmed correctly before you create these custom shooting modes, because all the button customization is also built into those custom shooting modes. So if you changed a button layout, you'd actually have to change it on all 3 custom shooting modes. And so I try to customize all of that before I program those custom shooting modes. That just makes life way, way easier. So if you go into the little kind of settings menu, it's the little wrench icon, and then go over to menu number 5, you have custom shooting mode C1 through C3. So these are found, if you click the mode button, you can see you have like your typical shutter priority and aperture priority, and then you have these things at the bottom, C1, C2, and C3. So these are custom shooting modes that kind of basically retain whatever settings you have assigned to them that you can recall just by going to that mode. And so the way that I have these set up is I have my C1 set to be my 4K 120. So I have the high frame rate turned on. I have my shutter speed programmed to 1/250th of a second. So basically, if I want to shoot in 4K 120, I just click mode, click C1, and now I'm shooting in 4K 120. My shutter speed's there, everything's programmed correctly. I have C2 programmed to shoot in 4K 60. And again, the shutter speed follows that. I have that already programmed in at 125th of a second. And then, you guessed it, I have C3 programmed to shoot 4K 24. This is super, super convenient if you're kind of on the move, shooting events, shooting documentary style kind of stuff, where you want to switch between ultra slow motion stuff and maybe full real-time cinematic stuff, rather than having to go into the menus and go, okay, 4K, I want to switch to 24, and then go and switch your shutter speed, all those kind of things. You can literally just click mode, cycle over to C1, C2, or C3, click OK or set, and then boom, you're in the mode, everything's set, everything's good to go. And that's why I've programmed that little depth of field preview button on the front of the camera to be my mode button. I don't have to like move my hand around to try to tap the mode button on top. I can just tap it with my finger right here, click mode, cycle over, and now I'm C1, C2, C3, all of those are super, super accessible. But it gets even better because when you go into the custom shooting mode, you can go to this setting called auto update set. Basically what this does is this tells the camera every time you make a setting change in that custom mode to retain those settings. So for instance, this becomes super helpful if you're switching your white balance around and say you're shooting inside and you have a white balance of 4,000 Kelvin or whatever, and then you go outside and you're like, oh, I need to bump that up to 8,000 Kelvin or wherever you happen to be. You switch away from that setting, you come back, the setting would be at whatever you had originally programmed it to be, which means you have to reset all those settings. But if you have this auto update set function enabled, it actually retains any settings that you do in the camera, any changes that you make, white balance, picture profiles, aperture, any of those kind of things, all of those automatically update and save every time you make that change. It's super helpful for running gun stuff because you can go from 120 to 60 to 24 and all the way back, and any setting changes that you make will automatically update within that custom setting. Now, obviously that doesn't update across the platform. So if I switch, Kelvin numbers on the 4K 120, it's not gonna switch the Kelvin number on the 4K 60 or the 4K 30, but within that actual custom setting, it's incredibly, incredibly helpful. So having those custom settings all programmed, having those custom modes all set up, having those set up is a huge, huge way to make your camera way more versatile, way more powerful, and just make your shooting process so much easier. So hopefully that's a helpful look at the R3 and kind of how I set this camera up for video. Again, if you're interested in learning how I set this camera up for photos, I'd be happy to make a video on that. Just leave me a comment down below and I will get to work on that. If you have any questions about why I set things up a certain way, or something doesn't make sense, or you want more clarification on something, feel free to ask. I'd be happy to help you out with any of those kind of questions, and I will see you in the next video. All right, peace.